Am I starting?
I think you're going to start. I think Jason's going to carry the thing. I'm John Horn of the LA Times. This is Jason Blum.
Here.
We're going to chat amongst ourselves with you for 45 or so minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So, Jason, the floor and the seat is yours.
So what I thought I'd do is, for 5 minutes, just kind of give a brief how the company arrived at what we're doing, and then we'll talk after that. So my company's called Blumhouse, and we do low budget, we try to do low budget, wide release movies, and the way that happened for me is I'm 45 years old, and in my 20s I was an executive. I worked at Miramax. I worked for Bob and Harvey, and had a crash film course for about 5 years, and in 2000 I left. I always really wanted to have my own production company, and I started it in 2000, and I produced 8 independent movies, 7.5 of which no one's ever heard of. And I got frustrated at making movies that nobody saw. And so I called my friend Brian here in the front row and told him I was frustrated about making movies nobody saw, and Brian helped me make a big studio movie. And the only big studio movie I ever made was a movie called The Tooth Fairy with The Rock. And I was 35, it was like 2006 or something like that. I can't do the math. And I couldn't stand it. It was what I had kind of always, what I thought I really always wanted, and I was the producer. We made it in Vancouver, and I was there every day in the trenches, and I just hated everything about that job. But what I loved and what I got from The Tooth Fairy is that I got to see from the inside how a studio movie was released. And my independent movies was one guy kind of drawing a video box and selling the rights to HBO for $30,000 and calling the theater. And then I went into a room at Fox, and there were 100 people, and there was one person in charge of like car dealerships in the South where the contest for The Tooth Fairy was going to take place. And I remember I was so struck by the fact that it was $11 for that movie I made with one guy, and $11 for this $65 million movie and another $40 million in marketing. I always thought that was kind of amazing, but I didn't know really what to do with that information. And right after The Tooth Fairy came out, Paranormal Activity came out. And I'm making myself sound smarter than I am right now because I wasn't totally aware of this at the time, but looking back, I was lucky enough that Paranormal Activity happened to me late enough in my career so that instead of saying like, oh my God, I'm gonna hold on to this scary movie success and just do anything scary, I said, if there's a way of kind of combining my experience up to that time, so if I can make low budget movies independently and have studios release the movies, that would be really cool. And I started talking about that after Paranormal Activity, and everyone thought it was nuts because everyone thought Paranormal Activity was a magic trick and would never happen again. And then we had the sequel to Paranormal Activity, which kind of fell into that category, and then we did Insidious, which we actually launched here, and then and people kind of thought I was less crazy, and then we did Sinister, which was the same model, which also launched in Austin at a different festival, by the way, and people then thought I was a lot less crazy. And then recently we had The Purge, and The Purge was for me the moment when the kind of establishment was like, wow, this guy is definitely on to something. And it was fun and very satisfying. And I think, we talk a lot about, and that kind of brings us to now, what the company does now, and John and I will talk about that more, and I'm gonna start letting him ask me questions about the company. But what we've talked a lot about is the kind of financial success of the movies, which is great and terrific, but actually there's kind of a much more interesting story behind that, which hopefully we'll talk about now. I told John I didn't want to know his questions, and I told him to be hard and tough on me because I love our model, and I'm ready to defend it or not. So that brings us to you.
That's my cue, I guess. Let's talk about the model. If you are making movies for $3 to $4 or $5 million, you're clearly not going to go to Iceland for 2 months. You're not going to hire ILM to do 2,000 visual effects shots. But what are you going to do? Are you going to have fewer shooting days? You're going to shoot only in one location? Are you going to look for interiors? In terms of like trying to figure out how you're going to make a movie for that amount of money, What are the things that are going to go immediately off the top, and what are the things that you absolutely have to make it work?
So locations go. So not too many locations, not too many speaking parts because of our friends at SAG. That makes it very expensive. We shoot all of our movies in Los Angeles. Not all, but 90% of our movies we shoot in LA because the budgets are low enough that rebate states, it doesn't make any sense to go to rebate states. We shoot 20 to 25 days. And always on every movie we do, everybody above the line, and that includes me, works for either free or the least you're allowed to be paid from the union. So free or for scale. And I think that's it. That's how we do our low budget movies.
So if somebody comes in and says, you know, I have to have a trailer, I've got my hair and makeup person, I need this person to do my styling, what do you say to them, and what are those conversations like?
We say, you can have all those things, but you have to pay for it yourself. And more often than not, those things go away. And I feel like, just to give a little background on the process of the company and the way it works, I feel like having financial parameters and keeping the budgets very low and working in a box creatively makes for much better work and much better movies. And the special effects go too, and that I think kind of makes the movies more interesting.
So if a movie like The Purge costs, what, $3 million and has grossed how much worldwide now? Is it over 100?
No, it's about 80.
Okay, 80 worldwide. So I'm somebody above the line on this movie. I've waived my normal fees. I've worked for scale. The movie's a huge hit. Is all that going to go to you? Is it going to go to somebody else? How are the talent who have taken this gamble with you going to be rewarded for investing themselves and their sweat in your production?
It all goes to me. No, it doesn't all go to me. So I'm gonna back up for a second and talk a little bit about the model and how it works. Basically what we do, we never work with first or second time directors. We work with experienced directors, and I make a deal with them when they come into the office. I say, we're not gonna pay you, we're gonna pay you a very little amount, but in exchange for that, you get to do what you wanna do. So most of our directors have final cut, and I often describe the company and the system of the company as auteur filmmaking, but for commercial movies. So it's a European system, except we're not headed to the art house or to Sundance, we're headed to the Cineplex. And I say to the directors, I can't promise you a hit, but I can promise you the movie's gonna be yours. And I think one of the frustrating things as a filmmaker is when you work for a studio, they pay you a lot of money. In exchange for paying you a lot of money, they tell you what to do. And if, for whatever reason, the movie doesn't come out like you hoped, we get blamed. So this is a way to get back at that system. That's not the answer to your question, but I was kind of filling in more of the blanks before we got to more specifics.
So if the movie is successful, is there a pool of money? Is it going to be triggered by box office bumps? Is there going to be...
So we share. Everyone participates to a certain degree in the profit of the movies, and that includes all our movies are union, but even the crew. There's a crew pool, and then there's bonuses. And when I did those independent movies that nobody saw, we spent a lot of time arguing about net points, and you kind of hear all these stories about what points in movies mean and what they're worth. And I had thousands of net points in those movies and never saw a penny. And so the way that we structure our back end is we key the payments to the box office in variety. So if your movie if it hits $30 million, you know you're going to get $50,000. And if it hits 35, you know you're going to get 50. And that cuts the negotiating way down, and it's very transparent. And in fact, one of the things I'm kind of most proud of about our company is that we are really transparent with our process. When a director comes, there are lots of benefits of low-budget movies. When a director comes and says, you know, I want a guaranteed wide release for the movie before I start, I say you're at the wrong company, because one of the benefits of doing low-budget movies is that you don't have to release them wide to recoup. So when you make a movie for $3 or $4 million and it doesn't come out exactly right, you don't have to spend $30 million of P&A on the movie to recoup. You can release it in a smaller way, make your money back, and keep going.
I want to pick up on that a little bit. You have a deal now with Universal. Is part of your understanding, or is part of the filmmaker's understanding, that even though they're going to have final cut, even though they can be their auteur within your model, if the movie somehow doesn't work, if it doesn't come together, it's not going to get a theatrical release. So do they know that going in? And if it's not going to get a theatrical release, what's going to happen to it? And I know you've made a couple of movies that have yet to be released theatrically. Will they come out? How does that process work?
Yeah, and just to elaborate kind of a little bit on how the creative dovetails with what I just said, I often use The Purge as an example, but I'm going to get to the movies that haven't had wide releases in a second. If I was a studio executive and someone pitched the idea of The Purge to me, which is we're going to make a movie about crime being legal for 12 hours a year in the United States, and that budget of that movie was $20 million, I would laugh that person out of the office because there's so many ways that movie and that story could go wrong. But at $3 million, you can try it and you can take a chance. And that one worked out and everyone saw it. But we did a movie, to answer your question, we did a movie called The Bay with Barry Levinson, or a movie called Plush with Catherine Hardwicke. And those are really cool, interesting movies, but they weren't right for a wide release. So those movies you can get on iTunes. I say to our directors, unlike doing a pilot, which disappears, I guarantee your movie will be seen, I just can't guarantee how it will be seen. So those movies were very limited released, like on 10 theaters or something, and then now you can get them in ancillary markets. And you were asking about what now?
Like, say, Joe Johnston's movie, or what happens to it?
Joe Johnston's movie actually comes out on not VOD, on DVD, Netflix, all those things. It's not coming out on VOD in like 2 weeks. The movies always come out. There's no point in holding a movie back, but sometimes it takes a long time. And a lot of times, these movies will be kind of, we finish the movie and then we'll test it and we'll look at it and it will be on the edge of a wide release. And we'll decide if we're going to spend more money and try and get it there or not. And that process sometimes takes a long time. Paranormal Activity, it took 3 years from the time when the movie was finished till the time it came out. And we reshot 50 times on that movie to get it right. So it's a long process, but they all eventually come out.
Speaking of a long process, and they all eventually come out, about 6 years ago, I think, I visited a set of an Oren Peli movie called Area 51. What happened to that movie?
That one, with that, Area 51 is most likely not going to be a wide release movie. And I promise you that movie will come out, but it'll probably come out in a limited way.
Meaning like one theater in Kentucky in the middle of the night?
Don't be mean.
Okay.
Don't be mean. No, it'll be on, you can rent it. It'll be on iTunes. It'll be on all those things that you can, it'll not be on DVD. Theatrically, it'll probably not have the widest release, although that's not for sure. Even that's not for sure yet, but I promise it will come out.
Okay. You talked about Tooth Fairy and making a movie at Fox, correct? Many of your films now come out at Universal. Where you have a relationship. How do you insulate yourself and your filmmakers from the studio? In other words, how do you create what is, to your mind, a successful and workable independent model within a studio framework? And what is the relationship in terms of their creative approvals, in terms of script approvals, the consultations? What is that conversation like with the studio?
Well, it's a product of the deal that we have with them. We submit a script, a budget, a schedule, and the director to them, and they can either say yes or no based on that. If they say no, we can finance it somewhere else. And if they say yes, they're very, very minimally involved. In fact, I'm working to keep them more involved. Technically, they don't have to be involved at all. They're my partners, so I share information with them, and I try and invite them to set. Sometimes they come. But they don't get very involved in the movie until we screen it for them and make that decision one way or another. And then they become very involved because we go from a $3 or $4 million decision, which is the budgets of the movie, to a $30 million decision, which is the P&A on the movie.
I'm curious in terms of finding filmmakers or choosing filmmakers that you're going to hire. In some ways, your model reminds me of like the House of Blues, that the bands you're going to see at the House of Blues are bands on the way up and bands on the way down. you're never going to get superstars. Do you have a preference in terms of up-and-coming talent, or guys like maybe Ian Softly, Joe Carnahan, Rob Cohen, who have something to prove, who have made movies before, and maybe the last movie or two haven't worked, and they've got something, they know they can do it, they can do it, but they have something they want to do passionately, and they've got something to prove?
I do. I make jokes. We're like the anti-Heat production company. So if we get a call and like, you got to see this short. It's the greatest short. It was the greatest short. It was just at South by Southwest or Sundance or whatever. Or like, have you seen this guy's commercial? Or the directors that everyone's chasing, we're not chasing. So if someone says they're meeting every studio in town, I'm always quick to say, then they should enjoy those meetings and shouldn't come here. My perfect director for these movies is someone like James Wan, who did Insidious when we hired him, or Scott Derrickson. So James Wan had done Saw, and then he'd had 2 very tough experiences with the studio, and then he was incredibly frustrated and couldn't get a movie made and had a ton to prove. And there was no way Insidious was not going to be a great, scary movie. Insidious kind of falls into the category of The Purge. When James Wan pitched Insidious to us, he said, look, the first 2 acts are going to be a scary movie, and the third act is going to be a David Lynch movie. And if he had said that to a studio, or if I had been working at a studio, and he had said that, it would be irresponsible to give that person $20 million, which is what a horror movie used to cost. But we gave him $1 million, and he willed that movie to work, and the movie worked because of him. Scott Derrickson was a similar thing. Scott Derrickson did Exorcism of Emily Rose, and then he did a big Keanu Reeves movie called The Day the Earth Stood Still, which didn't do so well. And he was not the top of the list to be hired, and he came in and he pitched us Sinister, and he's an incredibly talented guy, and that movie really worked because of him and Cargill. And those are my favorite directors. Directors with experience. It's funny that first-time directors get low budgets because really it should be experienced directors. First-time directors should get a lot of money because they don't know what's going to wind up in the movie and not. And experienced directors can do much more with less.
But also an experienced director is going to know that he or she is going to benefit from more days, they're going to benefit from more money. So are there different conversations you have about budget if somebody has more work behind them?
No. The budgets, no. And again, we're really transparent about that. And I think, like I said before, I think if you give someone parameters to work in, as soon as you take away a lot of the toys and as soon as you take away special effects, it forces writer-directors to focus on story and character. And even though in horror movies everyone talks about what the scares are, the scares don't work if the story and characters don't work. The story and character is much more important in a horror movie than what the jump scares are. And if you take away the toys, the director has nothing to focus on but those things. And so I think, it makes the movie stronger as a result.
You talked about James Wan. I wonder if part of the pitfall of success is that guys like James ultimately or inevitably are going to become so much in demand, are going to work in a slightly bigger world that you're going to lose them. In other words, are you kind of like speed dating people and you're going to maybe have a lunch date, maybe you've been in a relationship for a couple of months, but then they're going to find, somebody better and move on. And can you get some guy like James Wan to come back into the fold because he's off doing Fast and the Furious now?
No, we're not speed dating people. We've worked with, most of the directors that we worked with again. So James did Insidious 1, and then he did the Insidious 2. James DeMonaco did The Purge, did the first Purge, and he just completed the second Purge. So most of the directors we work with again. James said to me, one of my kind of proudest moments about the company is before we started Insidious, James said to me, my dream is I want to be JJ. I want to do big tentpole studio movies. That's my dream. And the fact that after he did a movie with us, actually 2 movies with us, and then he did The Conjuring, and then he got Fast and Furious, and I had a conversation with Universal about that prior to him doing it, and the fact that he got that job, which was his dream. I don't know if he would still say that, but I'm very proud of that, and I don't produce huge budget movies, and I don't think it's certainly in the near future I have any plans to produce big budget movies. But it makes me really happy when we have a director who goes from us to a big budget movie, and I'm sure James Wan will come back, and Scott Derrickson will come back, and James DeMonaco will come back. And there are occasionally those directors have asked me to produce larger budget movies with them, and sometimes I will, and sometimes I won't. But I think our model complements a lot of other ways to make movie and TV, and I think there's no better or worse way, but I think there's room for all of them to exist together.
One of the parallel perils of success is about actors, and that if you have an actor who has really defined a role, that he or she on the next time around is going to want to bump in their salary. In other words, that if you're doing franchise, if you're doing sequels, the actors start to have a lot of negotiating power, and you clearly want to maintain some sort of relationship with the audience in terms of who you're cast. How do you keep those actors in the fold, or do you do something like what you do in Paranormal Activity, where the filmmaker is more the star of the movie and the cast is, dare I say, interchangeable, but those movies are not cast-driven?
Well, I think it depends on what the sequel is. We never make movies. Whenever anyone's doing an original movie and they're in the office and they say, "Well, I want to end it this way for the sequel," I always say, "Don't do that," because if Paranormal Activity shows anything about sequels, it shows you can really make no one thought, everyone was like, it's going to be Blair Witch 2, that sequel's never going to work. So I think you can always figure out a sequel, but I think it's really bad to plan for a sequel when you're making a first. Again, that's a great thing about a $3 million movie. $150 million movie, it's irresponsible not to think about the sequel when you're doing it. Our movies are the reverse. So we don't think about the sequel, we think about making a really good movie, and if it's good, then we figure out the sequel after. And in terms of the actors, we don't get options on them, and sometimes we work with the actors again, like we did in Insidious, and sometimes we start with all new actors, like we're doing on The Purge, and that really depends on the content of the movie.
You said...
Sorry to interrupt. I'm going to go off here for a second. I think there's like an inherent hypocrisy in going to a studio, saying we need $150 million for our movie, saying as the director or the producer or the writer, you're gonna pay me $2 or $4 or $5 million. So the studio is at 150 plus your salary, and then bitching about being told what to do. I think that drives me crazy. It's why I'm at a place in my career where I'm lucky enough that I could produce big budget movies, and I choose not to, because the only way I feel comfortable telling a studio, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, is if I'm riding along with them. And as soon as I'm their employee, it taints that conversation, and for me, some people can do it. I just can't do it. For me, I'm much more comfortable with working with the studio as my creative partner, where we're riding along in success together, as opposed to the other way, which I just described.
Are you suggesting somehow that there's not enough humility in Hollywood?
Is it possible?
You said a second ago, what you are trying to do is make a really good movie. How do you define what a really good movie is? Do you look at your reviews? Do you only look at the box office? If you had to choose between 10 million more at the box office and 10 points higher on Rotten Tomatoes, what would you take?
That's a great question. I look at all the reviews, and that drives me nuts. Well, a measure of a good movie is not box office. I mean, for sure. I think what I look at is time. I think that's the best measure of a good movie, and you don't have the benefit of that when you release a movie. But I think the most important thing to me, one of the things I love about Paranormal is whether you like it or don't like it, what a touchstone that movie was, and what a weird original thing came out of Oren's head. And so I think the most important thing to me is, are they culturally relevant with time? I think The Purge might turn out to be that way. So that's what's most important.
When you're making a movie that is not a genre movie, I want to talk a little bit about Whiplash, which won the Grand Jury Prize and the Audience Award at Sundance. Is that a different kind of satisfaction? Is that a different skill set when you are not making a pure genre film, or is Whiplash in some ways kind of an arty version, arty drama that is following the genre model?
Well, we did Whiplash. I really learned this from Ryan Murphy. Ryan and I met a couple years ago, and he pitched a remake of a film that we actually wound up making together called The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which is a real slasher film. It was made in the 70s. It's an MGM movie, and we just remade it, and I'm really proud of it. I love it. But it's a very violent movie. And Ryan really is all over the place. He has Nip Tuck in American Horror, and he just directed, which I also produced this movie, the film version of Normal Heart for HBO. And one of the things, I think as soon as you figure something out and sit back and say like, okay, now I'm just gonna do this forever, I think your business is done. I think it's really important to kind of change and evolve. And one of the great things about having financially successful movies is you get to use that kind of that momentum you have in Hollywood to get things that are more difficult, things that I could never have made Whiplash 5 years ago. And so so one of the things that I want to do with the success that we've had is try and make different things and things that wouldn't normally get made, and add my name to something to help something get made that wouldn't. And Whiplash falls into that. Normal Heart falls into that.
You've talked a lot about how you try to keep costs down. You can't have an entourage, you can't have a hairstylist. You're going to give up all of your perks. And you keep your movies within that narrow $3 to $5 million range most of the time. And yet when the movie's done, if it's going to get a theatrical release, the studio distributing it is still going to have to put down $25 or $30 million. It seems like there's a dissonance between the financial model you've created for production and the financial model for distribution and exhibition. And I'm curious if that is something you've thought about, if you think there are any solutions to it, or if they're just always going to be on slightly different parallel tracks where one has a different financial model than the other.
I think about it all the time, and I don't want exhibition to be upset with me, because I think people will go see movies in theaters just as much as people will pay $250 to go see a play on Broadway, and Broadway's never done better than it has recently. So I really, I preface what I'm about to say with that. But one of my goals, when I talked to Universal, they said, "What would you like? What do you hope for in 3 or 4 years?" And I said, what I would love is to be sitting at a big table and have a movie and screen The Purge, and have a movie on the side that everyone thinks should be a wide release, and have a big meeting with 30 people, and run the models and run the numbers, and decide collectively that it's more profitable to release the movie on probably either on TV and move in a theater and on TV at the same time, and that there's a way to spend $15 million of P&A and do a day-and-date release, or mess with the windows in such a way that that we actually release the movie on TV and in a theater at the same time. That a wide release shouldn't always be the golden ring, and we're not there yet. But I think the only way that you can handle the $30 million P&A problem is by collapsing windows, which everyone says is gonna happen, but it hasn't happened yet here, it hasn't happened internationally. And I think when it does happen, all of us are gonna see much better movies. And I really also think, not to be on my soapbox here about distribution, but I think the fact that we haven't collapsed windows is pushing the best artists into television. True Detective would not have happened 8 years ago. Like, there's a reason that the longer that we hold on to theatrical windows, the more great people, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but if we want theatrical distribution to stay alive and relevant, I think that theatrical windows are not doing us any favors.
So even though you have a good and apparently fruitful relationship with Universal, and your movies come out through other companies, Oculus is coming out through Relativity, do you imagine a future in which you are the distributor, that you are creating the content and you have a company or some sort of structure where you are bringing movies to an audience and that you don't have to worry about a studio doing that work for you?
Well, I think I think technology is bringing the creator and the consumer much closer together, for sure. That certainly is happening all over the place. I think the studios it's hard to imagine the studios won't play a role in movie distribution, but the role is already changed and is going to continue to change. But I think that you have to have, I think that a movie's financial success, not cultural success, but financial success, is 50% the result of the movie and 50% the marketing of the movie. People in the marketing department of the studio will say it's 80-20, and people in the...
In which direction?
80 marketing, and people in the production department will say it's 80-20 production, but I really think it's 50-50, and I think marketing is incredibly important to the success of a movie, and I don't see that changing despite technology changing.
So when you are putting together a movie or deciding what it is that you're going to try to produce, or kind of, the boulder that you're going to roll uphill, how much in the back of your mind are you thinking about how marketable it is? And how, as a producer, are you thinking about those kinds of questions as you're developing, writing, going through drafts, and making a movie? In other words, is part of your job deciding not only which movies can be made, but which movies can be sold?
We think about how marketable a movie is from the second that we hear it. Again, great thing about low budget is we don't necessarily just make movies that we think are massively marketable, but it comes into the conversation at the first time we read a script. The marketability comes into the conversation. One of the other great benefits of giving a director total creative control over what he's doing is that suddenly he solicits us, or she. Hopefully she. We're trying to work with more women, But as soon as you relinquish creative control, and as soon as you give a director final cut, the creative conversation is much more fruitful, because there's no one posturing no one's wondering, oh my gosh, am I going to get my way? Am I not going to get my way? They know they're going to get their way. So if they know that, they ask us for advice all the way through the process, for notes on the script, for notes on casting, for notes through the shoot of the movie, and for notes on the cut of the movie. And a lot of those conversations from our side involve talking to the filmmaker about marketing and anticipating the meeting you're going to have with the head of marketing after the movie's finished, and what's going to come up in that meeting, and trying to address that stuff at script stage as opposed to at finished movie stage.
It's the way your business operates. It's not as if you have like a patent on some algorithm that Google owns. I mean, it's not as if you have this amazing intellectual property that's secret, or the formula to Coca-Cola. You're making movies on a model that anybody in this room or in Hollywood can see and try to emulate. At what point do you worry that maybe a year from now, every month there's going to be a $2 million horror movie that somebody's going to be released? And how does that not become a commodity? And if it becomes a commodity, how do you elevate your materials above what everybody else is copying?
I worried about it a lot more earlier on. But one of the things I've learned, speaking about humility in Hollywood, is that it's very hard for producers in particular, or executives, to kind of get out of their own way. I have no desire to be a writer or a director. I'd be really bad at both of those jobs. And so it's easy to be at a conference like this and talk about giving final cut and giving creative freedom to a director who, again, the only directors typically who get those things are, 10 people at the top of the list. And it's one thing to talk about it, but it's much trickier to do it. So change is hard in any industry, and people think of low budget scary movies, and they think of Roger Corman, and they think of, who I love but who had a different model. He used first time directors and kids, and they think of people starting out and people using it to get people using horror to get somewhere else. So we've been doing this for enough years, and that's not to say someone's gonna come up and nip at our heels, and that's good. I hope somebody does. but no one has because of humility. People in Hollywood, one of the reasons I love horror is because we're an underdog. Like in Hollywood, we're kind of, people have a prejudice against horror, and I always love fighting on that side. And people, successful producers will look at horror or low budget movies as something to do in between that $150 million movie. And we're very disciplined about the model. We stick to it. I'm not trying to use these movies to like get to a bigger place. I'd certainly trying to use the movies to try different things, but I'm very satisfied with what we're doing. And I think, I don't know, the longer that we've done it, the less worried I've gotten about that because I don't know, it's easy to talk about, and it's kind of, you have to be, it's kind of harder to do for reasons, I don't know, maybe it's humility, I don't know what it is, but that's my thought on that.
Within the horror genre, are there certain things you won't do? In other words, do you find yourself personally resistant to make torture porn, to go in the direction of the Saw franchise? Do you feel that there are certain things, even within an R rating, that you're uncomfortable having your name on?
Not really. I mean, you get sometimes people say kids in jeopardy, like every great horror movie, kids are in jeopardy for the last 30 years. I personally am not a huge fan of like very bloody movies. But like I said, this movie I did with Ryan Murphy kind of is pretty. Oh, the goriest movie we ever made was Barry Levinson directed it, which is kind of amazing. Barry Levinson wanted to make a documentary about pollution in the Chesapeake Bay, and his agent said, you know, no one's ever going to watch that, but you should turn it into a horror movie. So he did a found footage movie called The Bay, which is kind of like that Dustin Hoffman, which is kind of like Outbreak, but it's all these people drink the water and then just get horribly sick and have lesions, and it's super gross. And I love that Barry Levinson did it. So I think we have bigger problems than what you're talking about. So I'm open to anything. Although most of our movies, and this is a product of budget, we aren't that bloody because blood is expensive. So most of the movies, the scary stuff, you don't see it, it happens off screen. And personally, I think that's much scarier. I think what you can imagine is always much, much, much more scarier than what you see. So there's a reason Paranormal Activity or Insidious or Sinister, all those movies, the scares happen in your imagination as opposed to what you see. And I always think that's more haunting.
I want to talk about two films in particular, Purge 2. Purge 1 seemed to be a pretty self-contained story. I mean, to make a sequel to it almost seems like making a sequel to Titanic. The story ends. When you have a movie that's successful but is so contained, how do you go about solving the creative problem of, okay, there is a demand for Purge 2, and yet the story itself seems inherently not to lend itself to a sequel?
I'm trying to imagine the sequel to Titanic. I'd like to do that low budget. The sequel to The Purge, John, is Scream sequel. It's the concept, right? So we sold this idea of, which is this terrific idea that James DeMonaco came up with. He was having road rage. He was in the car with his wife, and someone cut him off. He was like, I wish it was legal to kill people, and that's what. He's a sick guy, and that's what gave birth to The Purge. And that's what we sold. What if crime were legal for 12 hours a year in America? What we delivered was a home invasion movie, as to what you're pointing out. But The Purge, the storytelling is so rich in that idea. So the sequel takes place outside the house as opposed to inside the house. And what goes on outside in those 12 hours as opposed to inside. But I feel like there's so many stories that you could tell around that concept. It'd be a great TV show too. So that's the direction we're going with that.
It's been a year, or the last couple of years, we've seen, I think, some of the best of kind of what feel like incredibly coarse IP ripoffs. Lego Movie being, I think, a great example of a creative solution to a Lego movie. Battleship on the other side, not so good. You have a Ouija board movie. How do you make a movie out of a Ouija board?
Well, we tried, but Ouija was in development at Universal. It was a $110 million movie, and we made it for 4.6. And I mean, a Ouija board's really scary, right? So we put a story around a Ouija board and talking to ghosts, and it comes out in October, and hopefully everyone else will think it's scary too. But I think it turned out pretty well.
You've talked a lot about TV and about how filmmakers are drawn to it and how the windows for TV are really attractive. As a producer, do you find yourself trying to develop and make more TV shows?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of television. What we haven't yet done in television is replicate the model in movies, and one of the things I'm really interested in doing in TV is having the same conversation with showrunners that I'm having with directors. So take a showrunner, and showrunners tend to have more money than directors, so they can even afford it more. But talking to a showrunner and TV is much more note heavy than the feature world. There's two companies. There's a studio and a network, and each one of them have tons of opinions about content. And so showrunners are really used to getting a ton of feedback. And going to a showrunner and saying, here's $3 million, let's make 10 episodes. Normally 10 episodes of TV would cost, on the low end, $20 million, right? So $2 million a piece. So I want to go to a showrunner who's had a lot of experience and a lot of notes and understands television but wants to do it his own way and say, look, let's do it for free, and let's do it for let's make 10 episodes of TV for $300,000 an episode, no pilot, and try to do what we're doing in TV in movies. We haven't done that yet, but we're close.
In a minute,
and there are other people who've done it in TV already, but go ahead.
In a minute, we're going to turn to questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can queue up at the microphone and try to make your question as short as possible so we can get to as many. There are obviously a number of factors that have brought you to this point in your career, but I think Paranormal Activity, the first Paranormal, it was critical. And I think if you could maybe share like the short story of how that movie almost didn't get released and what it has meant to your career, I think it'd be an interesting way to end.
Yeah, we'll do the 2-minute Paranormal Activity. So one of my many mistakes along the way is, and Harvey Weinstein never let me forget it, is when I worked for him, I was one of the people who passed on the Blair Witch Project. And boy, was that a mistake. And he never let me forget it, but it internalized something which, at least for me, I could only act on after having experienced it. So everyone says no one in Hollywood knows anything, no one knows what's gonna work, no one knows what isn't gonna work. And again, those are easy words to hear. They're hard to process. And for me, I processed them by passing on Blair Witch, watching Blair Witch go to Sundance, watching it be one of the less talked about movies at Sundance. So we bought a movie called Happy Texas the same time that Blair Witch was at Sundance, which we paid over $10 million for. Most of you probably haven't heard of it. And a little company called Artisan paid $1.2 million for Blair Witch. And I watched it go on to great success, and Harvey reminded me every week what a knucklehead I was. And he was right to do so. But the terrific thing about that is that Paranormal Activity came to me 10 years later as a sample. So I was sent the DVD. It was sold to, I forget who it was, Anchor Bay, or it was sold for $150,000. It was going straight to DVD, and I watched it. I never imagined it would turn into what it turned into. But I definitely was like, there's something cool going on with this movie, and it's gotta be able to play in a theater. And I called the director up, and I told him what I thought, and luckily he was kind of in a position that he wasn't gonna live or die on $150,000, even though that's a lot of money. And we met 3 days later, and I told him the Blair Witch story, and I said, you gotta let me try and get this into a movie theater. And he said, everyone's passed, everyone's seen it. All of Hollywood has the DVD, no one's gonna put it in a theater. And I said, just let me try, and I was very convincing. And we signed our deal, and the first thing I did was show the movie to John Horn, and John recognized what a great movie it was, and Ann Thompson, I also showed it to at Variety, recognized what a great movie it was. This is 2 years before it came out, and to make a very long story short, we played it, that was October that I saw the movie, we played it at the Slam Dance Film Festival. I had these great story from you, great story from Ann, we showed it to all these distributors again, and everyone passed all over again. And it's another panel to go through the whole long story of it, but 2.5 years later, it finally came out, and it was a terrific thing.
Let's start here. Let's make questions short so we can get to as many as we can. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. Your insights were fantastic, and I really appreciate you coming out. Just for, I'm obviously not a young filmmaker, but for somebody like myself who has a project that fits everything you guys do to a T, how do I get something in front of you, in front of your production company?
Well, we have a bunch of executives floating around who look at material all the time. But the advice I always give to filmmakers starting out is don't wait for me. Don't wait for the industry. Don't wait for a third party don't wait for people who think they know what they're doing to go forward. Like the way technology is now, if I were starting out, now my first movie I produced, I didn't really produce it, but that I tried to produce and I got a credit on it was Noah Baumbach's movie called Kicking and Screaming. And if that was today, instead of making that movie for $1 million, I would have made it for 50 grand or 25 grand and kept making stuff. I think it's a mistake to wait for Hollywood to tell you have a good idea. If you have a good idea, try and figure out the cheapest way possible and shoot it on your phone.
Do most scripts come to you from an agent, from a lawyer, with a writer or director attached? Do they
Most of the scripts we get come from direct. Most people understand our model now, and we get a director who's like, "Hey, I heard about this thing. I heard this person had a great experience. I want to give it a shot." And most of the scripts that we have, just like everything I've been talking about, are not new. Like they've been scripts that I always say to a director, like, "What's something that you've loved that you always wondered, like, why didn't this movie get made?" That's what I want to see, because everyone else is chasing what's new. So we don't do that.
But a screenwriter is going to have a better shot if he or she is able to pair with the director, and they're going to come in together. As opposed
But we've
to being
had
unsolicited.
more success that way. But we also, if there's an incredibly compelling idea that's just a script, we'll option that too.
Okay, thank you. Go over here.
I was wondering what role R&D plays in your business model. For instance, Ryan Kavanaugh has this whole Moneyball scheme to figure out what's going to work. Do you guys look at any sort of trends or data to say, okay, ghosts are hot, demonic possession is hot, anything along those lines?
No, I can't stand that. Drives me bananas. Our approach is a very Moneyball approach in a different way. And I'm appreciative to Ryan and had a great time with him working on Oculus. But I can't stand that. I'm like, if the story, again, you have to do that if you're spending 30, 40, 50 million dollars. It would be insane not to have R&D. When you spend $3, no. Like if the story is great and cool, let's make it. We don't have that much to lose. That's what's so fun about the model. That's what's so great about it, is that we don't have to worry about that stuff.
Your Moneyball approach is batting practice, right? If some guy hits the ball over the outfield wall, home run, that's the one you're going to release theatrically. If they hit grounders up the middle.
My Moneyball approach is this guy writes and directs for $800,000 Saw, right? He does 2 movies that are $15 and $25 million that aren't good. He can't get hired. The guy birthed, so whether you liked it or not, it was a cultural phenomenon. The guy cannot get a job. So my Moneyball approach is, instead of looking at the sexy statistics, look at the work. Right. And look at which of the 3 movies that he did, which one did he fully control, and which ones did he not control? That's the Moneyball
Look at his
approach.
on-base percentage. Okay, next question. Let's go over here. Go ahead.
Hey, so you mentioned earlier that you thought it would be a better system if first-time directors got the larger budget and that seasoned directors kind of know how to do more with less. Do you think there's any way whatsoever that could actually ever be a common situation?
No.
It does sound...
No, it was a theory, but no, it'll never happen.
It's just because the studios are so risk-averse, they're not going to give that kind of money to...
Well, when a first-time director gets a ton of money from a studio, they have no control. They have no control. The reason a studio would hire a first-time director and give them an $80 million movie, which does happen a lot, is so that they can control what that director does, which is it's a tough gig for the director.
What is in terms of a first director who's making a big studio movie, what is the most important person they're going to hire? Is it the producer?
The first director in a studio movie, even the producers they're never going to get a producer on there.
They're just
I
screwed.
don't know. They're in
screwed no
trouble.
matter.
They're in trouble. They could make a great movie, but it'll be a tough experience.
Okay, let's go over here.
Hi, I came in a little late, so I don't know if you spoke about this, but I remember...
Yes, we did.
The,
Go ahead.
the Demand It phenomena that happened around the first Paranormal Activity. I found that to be really interesting and encouraging and sort of demand-oriented box office sales. And there's companies now out there like Tug that are trying to essentially pre-sell tickets. Seems like a good way to utilize, in a more effective way, theater space and stuff like that. Whatever happened to that? Why didn't that take off?
Well, it takes off in different ways. Amazon does that now in a much more. By the way, Paranormal Activity, great example, the 50-50. Paranormal Activity never would have happened the way it happened if it weren't half marketing, half movie. But it does happen now in a much more advanced way. What Amazon does with their pilots is awesome. They make there's no genius deciding. It's the audience decides. If they get a bunch of downloads, they make more, and if they don't, they don't. I love that. I think that's so cool, and that's the 5-year later version of Demand It, which is even more. The audience has even more participation, which is basically, if you watch this, we're going to make more, and if you don't, we won't.
But is the audience always right? Does the audience know, if audiences are voting on not just pilots, but on ideas, on plots, which is another iteration of that model today, is that necessarily a good thing?
No, I don't think the audience was right, but I think there's room for it. I think if every green light of every TV show and every movie was because of the audience, that would lead to less good content. But I think there's room for that in the business, which is really interesting.
Okay, we're moving along. I like the short questions. Go ahead.
Just wanted to see kind of what stumbling blocks you were running into for doing television series at $3 million for 10 episodes. I had a deal with Mark Gordon, and we were looking at $350, $450 per episode. And they just, once they got a hold of it, it was like, okay, now we have our writing team, $100,000. We got our showrunner, $100,000. We got, the director and DGA rates, everything. We're another $100,000 on top of that. So we were at $750 to $850,000, and then you get a really good idea. And ABC was like, "Well, we want it. And we're going to spend $3 million an episode on it." And it was just something like we kept running into.
Well, you can't bring. Mark Gordon is an amazing but super establishment. Like, he's one of the biggest
Correct.
TV producers there is. It would be a tricky thing for him to put. He's doing too well in the conventional model. So the way to do that is, like, for you, I'd say instead of 300, do it for $30,000. Raise $300,000. Try and raise $300,000 on the internet and do 10 episodes for $30,000. Because again, if you're going to market, it's the same thing as you're going to the establishment, or come to me.
Absolutely.
Okay, over here.
Hi, yeah, I have a question about how you deal with music and marketability, because if you're making a really lean film and you're giving somebody a $3 million budget, the music that you have to choose for that, the composers are kind of a different class. But then if you're going to go sell this in a studio model where you're going to spend $20 to $30 million and you're thinking about marketability and possibly soundtrack and how things play to an audience, how does that change? Do you make the determination that a film's going to be wide and then
back to the Moneyball thing? Not to overuse the analogy, the composers are in a different class. So the composers, the DPs, the production designers, all of those people are very expensive people, very experienced people with very fancy credits. On not every movie we do, but most of them, it's one of the benefits of working with directors who've done a few movies is they tend to bring their kind of team, and oftentimes the composer is part of that team, and they're all participating in the profits of the movie. So we're working with people who have fancy resumes, but they're foregoing the typical process to get to do what they want to do. That kind of trickles down. It trickles down to the composer too. When the people who when the DP and the production designer and the editor and the composer know that the only person they're answering to is the director, their job is much more fun than it typically is. So more often than not, we get very experienced people, and we do the same kind of back-end deals for music as well.
For licensing.
Yeah, for licensing.
How are they coming up with their compositions? They obviously can't have a 80-piece orchestra do the score. So how are they actually creating and recording the music?
They have to be innovative of the production of the music, just like we're innovative of the production of the movie. Yeah, we don't have big orchestras.
Okay, over here.
Would you talk a bit about your office van?
Your office van.
My minivan. I hate driving. I have my dream when I moved to LA in 2000 was to be driven. And when Paranormal Activity happened, I took a Chevy Astro, which I bought for $10,000. I put an office in the back of it, which was an additional $20,000. So for the price of a Prius, I have an office in a van with an internet and a flat screen TV, and I don't have to drive in LA anymore.
And what do you do in it? I mean, do you have meetings? You watch screenings? Do you look at dailies?
I do my email. I do exactly what you do at your desk. I just do it in my car. So I mostly look at my computer and do email and do calls, and occasionally I'll look at dailies and look at movies when it's not work time. But when it's work time, it's just like your desk.
And does this remove parking tickets as a line item on your budget?
There's no parking tickets. Yeah, it's remove parking tickets in a trailer.
Okay. I think this, unless somebody's over here, this could be our last question, which would be perfect timing. So go ahead.
If you're not in LA producing, do you see a benefit to state incentive programs and farming those out to try to get the best out of wherever you can shoot?
Do I see? Not for low budget movies, because the reason that we don't, if you're making a movie for $3 million and you have to, you're shooting it suddenly in Louisiana, then you're spending your rebate traveling to Louisiana. Also, to be a low budget movie shooting in a rebate state is a disaster, because rebate states are so busy that you get the worst crew ever because there's plenty of work in rebate states. So I don't know if that answered your question. Did it?
Yeah, that's a good. I think you've answered it, but let me ask an iteration of it. Does that mean when you stay in LA that you get better crews because they're working close to home?
We get way better crews, but the much more important thing about shooting in LA is we get way better actors, because you can ask, and I don't think it's morally right. It's fine to ask an actor to take a ride with you and get paid if the movie works, and if it doesn't work, essentially not get paid, gets low budget scale. But then, and most of our stories are about mom and dad and 2 kids or 3 kids, and so mom and dad actors usually have real kids. But to say we're going to pay you scale, but you got to go to Hungary or Czechoslovakia or Montreal, never works. And I would totally get that. If I was an actor, I'd be like, hey, I'll give this a shot if I can say goodnight to my kids. But if I'm traveling to Montreal, I want my $1 million. So we get much, much better actors in the movie as a result of shooting in LA.
Didn't you just make a movie in Shreveport, though?
We did. We made a movie in Shreveport. We were as I said that. I said 80 to 90% of what we shoot is in
Okay.
LA. Sometimes we will travel. On that specific movie, we were a producer for hire, so we didn't have as much control. We were hired by MGM, and they made us shoot there.
Okay, but you'd much rather be in LA, if not Austin.
Much rather be in LA, and most of the time we're in LA.
If not Austin.
Well, always rather be in Austin.
That is all the time we have. We got to turn over the theater. Thank you guys for coming.